In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about immigration, and we're going to hold the announcements for a little bit later because we've got an opportunity to hear right away here from someone who's got a great perspective on everything that's going down right now on the immigration debate in our country. And she'll be able to explain for us a little bit of the background of President Trump's executive order on immigration and some of what's been going on in the Ninth Circuit Court, which also has a nickname, the Ninth Circus Court. It's also called some other things. And so now I'm here joined by Jenna Ellis, who is a constitutional law and criminal defense attorney and law professor at Colorado Christian University, where she directs the legal studies program. Jenna, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thanks, Kurt. Thanks for having me.
Of course, yeah. So tell us a little bit about, so for our listener who may not know what's been going on, the executive order, it was a temporary ban from immigrants from 7 countries. Do I have that right?
Immigrants would be a little bit overbroad. It would
Too
be
broad.
People who were coming in for any purpose. And so in terms of just the executive order, and there's been a lot of really, fake news, if you will, that has gone on just on both directions. And so from a broad perspective, people keep saying, executive orders are now fine with conservatives and it wasn't fine with us for President Obama. But what people need to realize is that the executive branch, any action from the executive is executive action by definition. And an executive order is a more formalized version of that. And so it's the same thing as Congress can make law. We know constitutionally in Article 1 they have all legislative authority. So it's not the fact that they're making law. It's not the fact that Trump is engaging in an executive action. What determines whether or not it's constitutional is the substance of it. And so we need to actually analyze, is the substance of the law that the legislature is passing constitutional versus what Trump's executive order, is the substance of it constitutional? And that becomes ultimately the question that the Ninth Circuit got wrong. They had a 29-page opinion that brought in his campaign statements that put the burden back on the government to show that there was really any legitimacy for this order. I mean, it seems completely outside of the legal scope. All they had to do was say, okay, the substance of this temporary ban on a geographic area. So it wasn't against Muslims and it wasn't a ban. It was temporary against a geographic area.
Okay.
Which is completely constitutional, has nothing to do with religion. Is that acceptable? And if we look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Congress has the power to generate the rules and the criteria on immigration and naturalization and visas.
Sure.
They delegated that authority legally and through a law in the United States Code that said when the president finds, so his unilateral discretion,
right.
when he finds that there's a reason that it will be detrimental against the interests of the United States, he can put a restriction for the time that he sees fit. So clearly his executive order was completely fine.
Yeah, and this is not
that wrong.
This is not the first time that a president has done something like this. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Obama did the same thing, and there have been previous presidents that had utilized. I mean, this rule has been in place, this law from Congress, since the 1950s. So the fact that the left is getting so up in arms and the Ninth Circuit thinks this is completely outside the scope of anything any president has ever done, and Trump is dictating like an imperialist, is just not true, and they're generating fake hysteria. I
see. So maybe it's just maybe is it the timing of it because people see and they think the U.S. should bring in these refugees Why do you think there is sort of so much drama here compared to, say, when President Obama did it?
Literally just because it's a different administration. I think if
this is
Obama
just partisan
was still
politics.
The president, absolutely. If Obama was still the president and he's perceived as someone who, cares about Muslims and he's okay with that, then if he'd had a temporary hold, then the left would be fine with it. But President Trump, they're trying to make this about religion rather than geography, and the left is completely shocked that President Trump is in office. And so no matter what he does, they're going to create hysteria, and they're going to use this term constitutional and not apply it appropriately. Whether or not something is constitutional to the left is whatever they say that the Constitution means, and that was true for the Ninth Circuit in their opinion.
Okay, so tell us what's been going on, because there was a court case, which, speaking of a fast and speedy trial, this thing got a trial really quickly. Tell us what's been going on with the Ninth Circuit, and for those of us that don't have a judicial background, I mean, what is the Ninth Circuit? What level of court is that at?
Right. So it actually didn't get a trial. What happened at the district court level is that this, which is just the first level, the state of Washington asked for a temporary injunction, which is the legal term for saying, court, you need to not enforce and have a temporary hold against Trump's executive order, and basically stop that from being enforced. The state of Washington's federal judge issued that and said, yes, we're going to temporarily hold that and say that is no longer in effect. And so then Trump's attorneys, the White House counsel, appealed it to the Ninth Circuit, which is the Court of Appeals. That's the intermediary court. Okay. And then the highest level from that would be the Supreme Court. Right. So the Ninth Circuit, it includes several states in the federal system. The circuit courts are over a number of states, not just one. So the Ninth Circuit includes the state of Washington. So it was appealed there very quickly. The court heard arguments and they issued their opinion within about 2 days, and upheld that temporary injunction and said, we agree that this was unconstitutional for several reasons that were not actually valid. But this is just another move by the left to forum shop and to say, we're going to go to the Ninth Circuit, which is highly liberal. About 85% of their opinions are overturned by the Supreme Court because they're an activist court. Had another state filed it and say that it would have been in the 10th Circuit, where the nominee Judge Gorsuch is from, which has a much, much better track record of actually applying the text of the law, not political partisanship, we probably would have had a different opinion. So the left was strategic by trying to get this in front of the Ninth Circuit rather than a court that would have actually done the constitutional thing and simply applied the law. Gotcha.
Okay, so it seems then, so correct me if I'm misunderstanding, so then this case will then be brought to the Supreme Court where, because there are only 8 justices right now, that could end up in a tie, which means the Ninth Circuit Court ruling would stand. Is that right?
That's right. And so it doesn't have to go before the Supreme Court. And right now, Trump's White House counsel has not yet filed that petition in the Supreme Court. He can, or what in my opinion might be a better action is to simply redraft an executive order that would specifically state that this isn't Muslim or a ban. And kind of circumvents the Ninth Circuit that way by saying, okay, we'll let that stay in place, but here's a new executive order that addresses what were the so-called flaws. So he has a couple of different options here, and he can certainly petition to the Supreme Court. They would hear it, and you're exactly correct that because we don't yet have a Ninth Justice confirmed, if it was a 4-4 split, then the Ninth Circuit's decision would stay in place. And that may create some bad precedent coming from the Supreme Court, so that may not be, in terms of the future of the country, be the best precedential decision. But we'll see what Trump decides.
Okay, interesting that they might sort of reconsider if you will, a do-over with another executive order. But that's good. I mean, so then personally, my own beliefs, I felt like, at least maybe in some of how the rollout happened, to prohibit, for example, green card holders, that didn't sit well with me because, they already had legal, a legal right to be here. So what have been your thoughts on the executive order? Have you been in favor of it? Have you been entirely in favor of it? Some parts of it? What have been your thoughts?
Well, I think that there's a different question on whether, politically a person is in favor of it versus whether it's constitutional. And those lines have been completely blurred because whether or not something is constitutional, that's a different question, and that's why we elect our representatives. President Trump may make some political policy decisions that people don't like, but he can do that. And so in terms of just looking at the text of the order, it was constitutional. So regardless of whether the individuals, in America, we're going to have a diverse opinion, but that's why we have representatives. That's why we have the separation of powers. Yeah. And Trump is in office. And so I fully support the president doing constitutional things. And we can debate all day if we agree with his policy decision. And frankly, I haven't been security briefed enough to know if this was particularly, justified or not or what, but that's not the standard. It's when the president finds that there's an action in place that will be detrimental to the interests of the United States. And I think we need to trust our president. We need to trust our leader when he makes those actions that are consistent with the constitutional framework and the laws flowing from that. And so whether or not we agree with this specifically, I think it's a good thing that President Trump has the interests and the security of Americans in mind. That's a good thing, in my opinion, that he's willing to say America comes first and the security of our citizens comes first. That's what the civil government is designed to do. That's what it should do. So I'm fully behind President Trump in terms of this particular action for those reasons. Gotcha.
Okay, so basically, personally, you would sort of hold more an agnostic position that because you're not privy to, certain intelligence, we're just not in a place where we can say whether we personally agree or disagree. But at the very least, constitutionally, he's got the right to do that. Have I understood?
Sure,
that?
And I don't know if I would describe it as agnostic specifically, but I would say, just the same thing as when people ask me to comment on, the current celebrity case that, whether or not someone committed a crime and it's a big deal in the media. I'm not the fact finder in those cases. I only know what the media has said about that. And that's why we have juries. That's why we have judges in those fact finding positions. In this case, President Trump and his administration are the fact finder. And so we need to trust that rather than speculate on things that none of us actually are privy to.
I see. Boy, yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I know, because there are a lot of people out there that say, well, we should take refugees, and we shouldn't have a temporary ban. It separates families, that sort of thing. But yeah, maybe there's a national security issue at stake here. And so, maybe we do need to put a pause while we reevaluate the system. Is that right? Have I understood that correctly?
And that's exactly the point, is that this is temporary. This was for a maximum of 6 months or 180 days. This isn't something that he's saying, we're not taking in any refugees ever again. This is something where the civil government, from a biblical and a truthful perspective, the proper role of government is to preserve and protect the rights of its citizens, which include the right to life and liberty. And so that's what the civil government is doing. And when Trump cites national security as his rationale, which he doesn't even have to, he has for any reason that he finds under the law, and that's constitutional. But when he's saying there's a national security interest in mind, that should satisfy Americans to say, this is temporary. Let's wait, let's see, and let's let the administration do that. That's exactly the kind of discretion that the liberals gave to Obama in 2011 when he did the exact same thing for those 7 countries. So why we're not trusting the people who are actually in the know, that's problematic, and that screams political more than it actually shows any sort of legitimate constitutional analysis.
Gotcha. Okay. So I know we're short on time here. So just sort of give me your closing thoughts here on all of this this brouhaha. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, so will there be an executive order that sort of clarifies these things? Are things just going to kind of be put to rest? What's going to go on here?
Well, I think that from a very temporary perspective, as far as what will happen in the next days and weeks with this particular executive action, Trump has a couple of alternatives, like we talked about, and but for the future of his next 4 and possibly 8 years, this raises some significant questions over the legitimacy of our judicial branch. They're not supposed to be political, and this should concern every American who really understands our governmental structure and our framework. And so I think there's a lot to be educated on there. I published a piece in National Review yesterday, actually, that talks about this, and I would encourage people to go read that article. There's a few others by the editorial board. David French, who's another attorney who has written some really good articles on this point. Get educated and also understand where this one instance fits within the whole makeup of what we're going to see over the next 4 years, and don't just jump to conclusions that just because Trump's actions are political, that by definition means they're unconstitutional. We need to take a step back and actually analyze things appropriately. And for anyone who wants to follow my page, I try to post my analysis on some of those things. So follow me on social media, Twitter, JennaEllis.org. And also, email me or ask me any questions of these types of things, because I think it's important that each person actually gets educated on our Constitution and our system of government. And the one good thing out of all this is that the left is finally rediscovering that the Constitution exists. So maybe people will actually start getting educated through this process.
You mean, maybe they just remembered after 8 years. So
yeah, we'll see how long the fog has lifted, but yeah. So I'm actually really excited that more people on both sides are interested in reading the documents and figuring out what our government framework really looks like.
Yeah, Jenna, thank you so much for joining us today, and we've got to bring you on sometime in the future to talk about your book, The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution. So thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks. I'd be happy to, and I'll speak with you soon. Thanks.
Great. Take care. Bye-bye. All right. So that was Jenna Ellis. She is a constitutional law and criminal defense attorney, a law professor at Colorado Christian University, where she directs the legal studies program, and author of The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution. So go ahead and check out our book there on Amazon, and we'll have to bring her on the show to talk more about that someday. So we're talking about immigration today, and if you want to join us, if you want to have your voice heard, the number to call is 5052-STRIVE. That's 505-278-7483. Now, there are a number of ways you can get in touch with me, so you can give us a call there at that number. You can also text. So we've got this great texting program. Just text the word Veracity to 555-888. That's VERACITY to the number 555-888. So I got a text message from number... the last 4 digits ending in 1992. When this person heard that we were doing the show on immigration today, they wrote, "You better not talk about any of all that fake news stuff. Besides, you're biased because your great-great-grandparents were immigrants." I take it that this person is being sarcastic here, but to a certain extent, there's a little bit of truth in everything, right? So the point is, how should we think about this stuff about immigration? I mean, surely, as Jenna said, and even as this texter here clued in, there seems to be some quote-unquote fake news. That's a big term recently. But basically, we need to think critically, and we need to research the facts, and we need to interpret the facts clearly, and to think about these things rationally, while at the same time we need to recognize, too, the relational aspects to policy, that sometimes policy has a way of prohibiting family from being together. I know that there are a variety of perspectives on immigration. So when I was spending a semester in Washington, D.C., I did some work studying immigration. And interestingly enough, one of the things that I discovered was that immigration policies can span the partisan spectrum. And what I mean by that is, we might have our typical ways of talking about how a certain party believes this and a certain party believes that. But really, That's not always the case. There are a number of GOP senators and congressmen, for example, that are very much in favor of having lots of immigration. There are some GOP senators that are against having lots of immigration in terms of legal immigration. There are some Democratic senators and congressmen that are very much in favor of legal immigration and lots of it. But you might be surprised to discover there are also Democratic senators that are not in favor of lots of immigration. They prefer smaller levels of legal immigration. So really this debate spans the spectrums, because you can't quite fit folks into categories as easily as you might suspect. And so it's not necessarily a partisan thing here. I know Jenna mentioned, and I think to a certain degree she's right, in this instance, that there has been outrage because the president has a different letter by his name. But sadly, you always get that. So we've got to try our best, I think, to treat the president fairly, and we shouldn't just criticize because they have a different letter next to their name. I was even speaking out on this to people, to my friends, when President Obama was in the White House, that we shouldn't just attack him because he was a Democrat, for instance. We shouldn't attack a president just because he's a Republican. We should stick to the policy points in terms of critiquing policy. We shouldn't just critique for the sake of critiquing whenever we possibly could. We've got to pick our battles. So the immigration issue, it's trickier than you might think. And there are a lot of issues at stake. For example, do people have a right to free movement? Do people have a human right to go to the country they want? Some people think yes. Some people think no. Then there are certain realities too at stake that we deal with, and some of those realities are that if 1 million immigrants showed up tomorrow, that could do a lot of damage to our economy, and so we need to make sure that the economy remains stable. So we can't just take 1 million immigrants tomorrow. Then, of course, there are issues of national security where you've got to have a vetting process. And so what does that vetting process entail? Well, we're coming up to a time for a break in our show. But let me just say this. I think that a lot of people have watched certain cable news networks. They've seen, say, immigrants showing up in Germany by the trainful, and they fear that something like that would happen here. After the break, I'm going to talk about how that idea is a misconception, and then I'm also going to describe the vetting process for specifically refugees. I'm not going to talk about each of the vetting processes because there are different types of visas out there, but specifically for people trying to come in on a refugee status, I'm going to talk about the process that entails after this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
defending Christianity, religious liberty, legislating morality. Join renowned speaker and award-winning author Dr. Frank Turek for his biblical insights on today's issues at the Illinois Family Institute Worldview Conference, Saturday, February 18th at the Village Church of Barrington.
If you want to be in government, only atheists can be in government. Does it say that anywhere? No.
The Illinois Family Institute Worldview Conference.
Pastors were not called to be tax exempt. We were called to be salt and light.
Tickets for the IFI Worldview Conference are $20 per person and just $50 per family. Student scholarships are available. Seating is limited, so please register at illinoisfamily.org or call the IFI office 708-781-9328, illinoisfamily.org, or call 708-781-9328.
Are you tired of wasting your time and money on ads that just aren't producing? What if there was an easier way to get great advertising results with tons of traffic and social engagement to your brand without wasting your time or money? Well, there is an easier way, and it's called trafficbuffet.com, a new and easy way to generate the traffic you need through our global network of publishers, all with one click. Explode your site traffic and send tens of thousands of potential customers to your site daily. Build your brand with our social campaigns like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and more. Our dedicated account reps provide amazing support. So don't wait. Get started today. TrafficBuffet.com. Measurable results, driving success.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
All right. Well, thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. So before the break, we had on Jenna Ellis, who helps talk to us about the recent executive order by President Trump on immigration, and sort of more of the specifics about that executive order, what's been going on in the court system, and sort of what she thought might happen in the end here in terms of how it's going to all pan out. Now I want to talk about, though, the refugee vetting process. And the reason why I want to do that is because I perceive that a lot of people are unaware of the process that it takes to come into this country with refugee status. And that's a careful nuance. I'm not going to be talking about other standard ways of immigrating to the United States. I just want to talk about the refugee process that it takes, because I perceive that a lot of people, they might be watching a cable news network, they might be reading news articles about what's going on in Germany, where immigrants are sort of wreaking havoc on some towns, issues of assimilation there, which is another thing I want to talk about later in the show. So one of the things I am concerned with is that there is this misconception here that the way that immigrants have showed up in Germany is the way they'll show up here. Now, when we're talking about refugees, that's not the way it works. In Germany, when people showed up on the train load, they were not invited, in the sense that they did not receive a formal invitation to enter the country. They just showed up. And so the German government had to deal with that. Now, in our country, you have to be formally invited to come here. So what does it take for that to happen? Well, it's actually a process that takes a number of years, like 1 to 3 years. And the way to apply for refugee status, you start by going to the United Nations. So you go through the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. That's the first place you go to. Then that office forwards your application to the U.S. State Department, which prepares those applications for the Department of Homeland Security's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So you're talking 3 departments already, 3 agencies, to be more precise and exact there. And once all of that is done, then you've got to go through biometric and biographic checks done through various U.S. and other security databases. So let me list for you some of the databases that a refugee, someone seeking refugee status, has to go through. Are you ready? Here we go. So at the State Department, you go through the Consular Lookout and Support System, the Consular Consolidated Database, the Department of Homeland Security. You go through the TECS, which is a DHS or Department of Homeland Security security system, the DHS Automated Biometric Identification System. Then, through the National Counterterrorism Center and FBI's Terrorist Screening Center, you go through the Terrorist Identities Data Mart environment, and you also go through the Terrorist Screening Database. At the FBI, you go through the extracts of the National Crime Information Center's Wanted Persons File, Immigration Violator File, Foreign Fugitive File, Violent Gang and Terrorist Organization File. And then you also go through the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System. Through the Department of Defense, you go through the Automated Biometric Identification System. And then that's all to say, too, that this is just the U.S. stuff. You also, when you give your application to the United Nations, you also go through other systems, like Interpol system and other European systems, too. So this is all to say that there is a robust screening process for vetting refugees. And statistically speaking, it's not the refugees who typically file for the refugee status because this process takes so long. If you were trying to game the system to enter here in order to bring a terrorist attack, you would not use the refugee system. You would try to get a travel visa, or you would try to get a student visa. You would try some other way because it's easier and faster. All right. So I think that's really important to say. And also, when there are concerns about refugees, for the very few instances that this has occurred in the United States, and I recall one instance in Bowling Green, there was a terrorist plot, which they discovered after the fact. These are people that had refugee status, but after the fact were interested in bringing terror here. That is to say, this is homegrown terrorism, this term homegrown. So homegrown terrorism is one thing that we need to be concerned with. In terms of the vetting process, though, it's a very good process, and I don't think that we should be fearful of that. Now, that said, from what I have read online, I think President Trump is trying to bring or add another system up to speed, up to sufficiency. And in order to do that, I think that was one of the reasons for the temporary pause. So at the very least, I want to fight here the misconception that we're going to have refugees showing up by the plane load, because we do have this natural land barrier called an ocean, so they can't take a train here. So I want to fight that misconception because we've got to get our facts straight. We've got to know what the process entails. We've got to know whether terrorists are even trying to use the refugee status to get here, which by and large they are not. This is not the way. If you are trying to find potential terrorists, you would not be doing it. I mean, yes, we're already looking out for that through this process, through the refugee screening process, but that's just not. I mean, this isn't the way that they're trying to enter the country. So we need to be, in that sense, spending our efforts elsewhere, where we are successfully discovering these homegrown plots. So, again, that's one misconception that I want to fight. All right, so now here we've got an interview here with Dr. Danny Caroll Rodas, and I want to play this for you. It's a perspective from a biblical scholar, an Old Testament scholar, who's going to bring a slightly different a tone, perspective to the immigration debate. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this too. So here we go, and we'll go ahead and play this for you. Well, I'm joined here by Dr. Caroll Rodas. He is the Blanchard Professor of Old Testament at the Wheaton College Graduate School. Danny, thanks so much for joining me here on the show today. So you teach Old Testament there at Wheaton College, and you have a certain perspective, not just personally but academically, on immigration. So tell us a little bit about your recent thoughts on the executive order by President Trump, and also I know this is going to be a big blanket. I'm throwing it out there. Tell us your perspective on the ancient Israelites' view of immigration.
Well, thanks. It's great to be with you. You've asked me quite a lot there. So let me just get at it in pieces, and then you can ask for further clarification
Sure.
Or send me in another direction. First of all, I'm a half Guatemalan, so that's Rodas on my name, and that's part of how I get into this, because the immigrant discussion in this country, which has largely been until recently about people coming from south of the border. These are people that are part of my culture and my background. I go to an Hispanic church, things like that. I was raised bilingual, bicultural, lived a number of years in Guatemala. So all of those things come together from my interest in immigration or immigrants. And then in terms of being an Old Testament prof, what got me into this biblically was wondering what the Old Testament would have to say about it. So that's kind of how I got into that. So it's important maybe for your listeners to understand the difference between immigrants, refugees, and asylees.
Okay.
Most people don't parse those out, but the refugees, those are coordinated through the United Nations, and the way internationally it works is that every country has a quota, and so there is vetting by the United Nations, and then there's vetting by the particular country. And then when they get here, they come and they get government help for housing, language learning, and job training. But they come in and they're kind of legal residents. The immigrant would be, coming in on the particular visa system of the particular country, or if there aren't enough visas available, which is the issue in this country, they'll find, kind of irregular means to come. Asylees are people who are seeking very formally asylum, protection, and those are usually people fleeing from war zones, violence. Those are very hard to get because you have to prove that you actually qualify. So those are the three categories. Now, with the executive order recently, it wasn't about immigration; it was about the refugees. So that's an important distinction, and it was refugees from particular countries.
Yeah.
As I look at it, what's driving the executive order are issues of national security. So I can appreciate that. I think that's something every country has to think through.
Sure.
The question then is this the best way to go about it? Another question would be, how are these people being vetted as it now stands? For instance, let me give you just kind of maybe a question to think about. The people who are trying to get in as refugees from these areas are actually fleeing from the violence that we're trying to prevent. So that's kind of the irony of it. They're trying to run away from the very thing we're trying to not happen on our soil. So that's the irony. I mean, they're suffering from the very thing that we don't want to suffer from. But the issue is a lot of these, radicals would be coming from these countries, and so that's the link that's being made. Again, the question is this the best way to do it? Are they being vetted enough?
They go through this is a process that takes years, and I'm just not sure people realize to what extent and all the databases that they have to go through and background searches that specifically refugees have to go through.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem in this country is that we're confusing this with immigration.
Right.
And so the vetting process for refugees, like I said, is coordinated with the United Nations. So it's a much more complex process.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think people are aware of that.
It seems
I can appreciate the national security question, but the follow-up question is this the best way to do it?
Yeah, well,
are these people you want to target, these kind of things.
And are terrorists even using the refugee status in order to gain access into the country?
Well, the thing that would follow up on that is vetting takes time. So would a potential radical go through all these processes and wait all this time to get the proper vetting for the possibility of getting into the country? I would think that if you're a radical, this is too slow.
Right, not the way to do it.
Yeah, so again, I can appreciate the security concerns. The question is this the best way to do it? Yeah,
it seems, even just from my perspective, that it's misplaced. And a lot of that comes from misinformation. So I know I've got a buddy, he's totally in support of this, and he just doesn't know. He doesn't realize that there is this vetting system. And part of me thinks that maybe, he's just watching cable news network and he sees like these images of Germany, for instance, where they take all of these refugees, but they show up by the train load, and they show up uninvited. And that's not how our system works here in America. They aren't just showing up by that plane load uninvited. The only way you can get in is if you are invited. So we do have this process. And people just don't realize that.
Yeah, and what we have, too, that Germany, let's say, or France doesn't have, is we have an ocean.
Right.
So it's not like what you're seeing in Europe, where, like you're saying, they're arriving in such huge numbers, and then they're trying to vet them all at the same time. And some of those that have been radicalized in Western Europe have been in those countries for quite a while. So it's not the immediate refugee fleeing a war zone. These are the children, the sons of some refugees that have grown up in France and feel disenfranchised and have been radicalized over time as they have grown up. I mean, so it's a very different scenario than women and children and grandmothers and granddads trying to flee the violence in Syria now. I mean, that's or from Yemen or something. I mean, it's just a different population is what it is.
Right. All right, well, let's move our focus a little bit to your academic work. So you've published books, Christians at the Border, Immigration, the Church, and the Bible. You're the co-editor of Immigrant Neighbors Among Us, Immigration Across Theological Traditions. Tell us a little bit about your research into sort of an Old Testament perspective on immigration and how then that applies to us today.
Well, what we don't get from the Old Testament would be some kind of blueprint for what we need to do today. It was an ancient society, so that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to see what kind of values does the Old Testament put to immigrants. And once you begin to scratch the surface, what you begin to see is that the Old Testament is full of immigration and migration. Whether it's ancient Israel moving for food, going into Egypt looking for food, or being taken away, what is now called academically forced migration, which would be exiles under the Assyrians or the Babylonians. You have return migration from Persia and Ezra and Nehemiah. So you've got all these migrations going on, even in Genesis with the patriarchs. So as I talk to immigrants, those stories in the Bible resonate with their experiences. The other thing that we see is the Old Testament will give us this whole notion of human beings being of value and potential, the Genesis 1 image of God. So that orients the immigrant discussion. So we're not talking just about faceless mobs of people, but we're actually talking about people who matter to God. And as a Christian, I would say Jesus dies for these people as he did for me. And so there's this value of human beings. And then what's interesting, and I'll just close with this because I don't want to go, I can go on for a long time on this, is there's a lot of Old Testament legislation to deal with outsiders, which is unique in the ancient world.
Huh.
Nothing like it in any other ancient law code that we have. And what you see is that God is providing safety nets within Israel to help these people. There's expectations that they will learn the language and things like that, but you have things for food and for work, allowing them into cultural rituals, all these kinds of things that show the hospitality. That we can learn from these things. And then I would say, as Christians, we can speak the values into the debate based on the scriptures of our faith.
Right. And it seems that there are alternative views as to how we should apply these principles today. I mean, for some people, it seems that we shouldn't, that their society was just so different that we shouldn't, apply much of any of those principles.
Right.
Whereas then there are others that say, well, we've got to be totally, open borders because, well, they had open borders. Which, like you said, maybe wasn't even necessarily the case. When, for example, the Israelites are trying to go through Edom, they had to ask for permission. And so I guess even back then there was some sort of immigration laws and policies for these cultures and societies.
Well, the thing is not to try to apply the specifics. It's to get a kind of an orientation. I call it a kind of a moral compass about how to deal with these people. And then, the thing about Edom, what you have is Israel coming across as a people group, moving through. They're asking for permission to move through to get to somewhere else. So that's not the same thing as an immigrant.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Coming across individually or something, trying to get food or a job. I mean, in Israel, what you have, or in those stories, what you have is a whole people group migrating to another place. And that's why, some of these, countries like Edom and Moab, they're very suspicious. I mean, because it's not just,
they want to make sure that the people aren't going to attack their people like it's an army invasion. Yeah. Trojan horse.
They're thinking what we would call national security because it's a group of people.
Yeah.
And again, you can understand it, right? But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the southern border.
Sure.
And it's not really the refugee discussion either. I mean, so you've got to be careful about how to coordinate the Old Testament with what's going on today.
Right. Well, Danny, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. I appreciate having your thoughts on this very difficult issue to understand, this hot topic. So thanks for your time.
Well, thank you, and I congratulate you for trying to grapple with things like this. We need to as Christians.
Of course, thanks. All right, so that was my interview with Dr. Danny Caroll Rodas at the Wheaton College Graduate School. And it was fascinating to get his perspective on how we should look at the Old Testament, because it's not so simple as just quoting the Bible verse, to welcome the refugee or the foreigner. There are other issues we need to think about, and the biblical text was written regarding a culture that is very different than our own today. And so there are things that we've got to consider when we're talking about immigration. Now, I want to briefly close out talking about refugees by reading a little bit from an article here by Natasha Hall. And after I do this, then I want to talk about sort of economic perspective on immigration. So here's what Natasha Hall writes in this article, and I'll link this at the website. The article is called "Refugees Are Already Vigorously Vetted. I Know because I vetted them." And here she writes, let's see here, that she has done numerous interviews, has had her career interviewing different refugees from 20 different nationalities in 10 countries. She's seen countless refugees break down, crying in the interview room because of the length and severity of the vetting process. Sort of the questions that have to be asked can be such a tough emotional experience for some people. So here's what she writes. She says, from from those experiences and numerous security briefings, it's clear that the authors of President Trump's order are unfamiliar with the U.S. immigration system, U.S. laws, international law, and the security threats facing our nation. She writes, I can't speak for all refugee and asylum officers, but I can say that those who have been working in immigration for years from opposite ends of the political spectrum are appalled by these new policies. She obviously just does not hold back there because she has been an immigration officer. So she has experienced it and knows what it's like. And so her perspective is simply that there's some ignorance here about the process of what it takes. So I hope in terms of refugees that we recognize that there is a process, a very strict and rigorous process for refugees to be interviewed and to be formally invited into the United States. Now, again, I'm not making a statement about other types of immigration. I'm just talking about the refugees here. So I'm just keeping the scope to that perspective. I just want to start small, if you will, before we would perhaps in later episodes go into the larger perspective. So I'm just sticking to that issue. All right, now let's talk about sort of economic issues here. So Bob here on Facebook writes, when considering comprehensive immigration reform, don't we have to consider that only immigrants are willing to take jobs others don't want? Well, that's an interesting question. I've heard that used a lot of times. To a certain extent, yes. I mean, we do recognize that immigrants do take jobs that we might not like. But look at this another way. If the economy is doing poorly, people would be willing to take jobs that they might not like to do in order to pay their bills. Now, one of the things we have to consider is the welfare state. Can someone make more money taking checks from the government, unemployment checks, or whatever sorts of welfare programs there are? Can people make more money doing that than working, say, a minimum wage job? Actually, the answer is, and this by and large depends upon your state in life, how many kids you have, etc. The answer is generally yes. And that's one of the things that really concerns me, that there's an incentive for people not to work, that people can live more comfortable lifestyles not working at all, and they would make more money doing so. That's one of the things we should be concerned about. And so I would be also interested in looking at comprehensive welfare reform. So I think we need to look at that as well. We need to look at the role of the federal government versus the states. So there's always this tug between welfare and immigration. And Milton Friedman there's this great video. I'll actually post this on the website as well, where he talks about this, because you can't have both. You can't have a robust welfare state and lots of immigration, because of course then the system is unsustainable. What you need to have is one or the other. You need to have a free market system that's pro-immigration, or a welfare system that disincentivizes immigration. So the question is, well, which one do we want? And so I'm not too much of a fan of the strong welfare system. Of course, I think there should be safety nets in the system. That doesn't necessarily mean the federal government should be responsible for that. That very well could just be a state issue. So that's one of the things we've got to consider. So Bob, there's that yes, we do see immigrants taking jobs we might not otherwise have, but let's look at what the incentives there, what the motives are, and would people really get to a certain position in life where would U.S. citizens get to a certain position in life where they might say, okay, I'll take that job I might not want, but it'll pay the bills. Finally, let me close out with this thought here. When we're talking about immigration reform, in the United States system, we are looking for immigrants that are highly educated, highly trained. So suppose maybe they don't have a lot of educational experience, but they've got a skill set that we're looking for. There are some concerns when the United States incentivizes taking those people away from their own countries. Just think about it. what do you do if you begin to take a lot of the doctors away from a third world country? Who's going to help the people that are sick? Yes, of course, there will be some doctors, but they might not be the best doctors. And some of those people need to be cared for. Now, the U.S., compared to some other countries, has a relatively small population. And so what we are doing is, in some sense, we might be taking away some of the elite from those countries. Maybe, just maybe, we don't want to do that. Maybe we should take other folks that aren't necessarily the highest qualified or in terms of educational experience or the highest skilled because we can train those people. So that's one of the key things to student visas. When you have lots of student visas, the idea here is that these people can come over for 4 years and do their undergraduate work or their graduate work, right, for a couple of years, and then in the hopes that they will then return to their home countries. Now, sadly, that's not always how it turns out. It's not always the case that immigrants return. And so in fact, many of the illegal immigrants that we have are people that have simply overstayed their visas because they don't want to leave, the great country that we have here. So that is one of the concerns. However, for those that do return, that's what we like, right? We like being able to train these people, but send them back to help their own people. So there are a lot of issues here with immigration policy. It's not so simple. It's not so black and white. There are a lot of gray areas when we're talking about immigration. Of course, yes, we need to consider national security, but that is only a very small fraction of the immigration policy. So there are other issues in immigration policy that we have to consider when we think about what we should believe about immigration policy, at least as it pertains to our very 21st century sensibilities here for those that live in the United States. Things can vary. For example, I was just thinking about New Zealand earlier this week. That country, they don't have to worry about building a wall because they're just two islands. I mean, that's New Zealand. So they don't have to worry about that. So the only border that they have to defend, of course, they've got to keep a lookout for the ships, that might arrive, but the airports. But they don't have that concern. So really, there are issues that countries deal with differently because they're in different situations. So there's not necessarily, this is something to consider as well. Immigration policy doesn't necessarily transcend different countries. It can be relative to the nation's interests. And speaking of those interests, there's assimilation that you've got to consider. So, and assimilation is often something that's just not spoken about. So assimilation is basically, what do you do when the immigrant comes here? How do they assimilate? How do they become an American? How do they join our culture? There are people that think, well, we should have a melting pot, which is where there is assimilation. There are people that think that we should just sort of have a garden salad, if you will, where people sort of retain their own cultures. I think that one leads to some problems. And so, but the fact of it is that we're not talking about assimilation issues. We're not talking about how do you educate immigrants about American history, American government. If these people end up becoming U.S. citizens, they should know about our system of government and the interests that we have, the things we want to protect, like the Constitution. These are things that we should be concerned about, but that people really aren't talking about. And so maybe to a certain degree, we've got to include that topic in the debate. And I wish we did that more frequently, even in, say, the recent presidential debates that occurred all throughout last year during the primaries and such. Assimilation is hardly something that gets brought up, but it's very important. I think in terms of having immigrants really, when they want to become U.S. citizens, have them become Americans. And even if they don't want to become citizens, if they just want permanent legal residence, what does it mean for them to be sort of an acting American here, sort of a functional American, for them to for them to enjoy our society, to appreciate the things we appreciate. Those are things we've also got to consider. Of course, there's never enough time in the show for us to cover a lot of these topics. I'd love to hear what you think about all of this. Different ways to get in touch with me. You can follow me on Facebook and Twitter, not just personally, but the show, Veracity Hill. And you can email me, kurt@veracityhill.com. If you want to send your thoughts that way, you can do so through the website. Or you can leave me a message throughout the week on our call-in line. Again, that number is 5052-STRIVE. That's 505-278-7483. So that does it for our show today. I am grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Those are folks that just chip in a few bucks a month. And we're looking to actually raise some more money for the show. We want to be able to pay someone to help us with social media. This person has been helping out so far, and we want to be able to show them that. And so if you could, and amongst the other things, our costs that we have for doing the show, we'd love to get your support. If you want to chip in just 10 or 20 bucks a month to help us out, your donations would be tax deductible because Veracity Hill is part of the Defenders Media Alliance, which is a 501c3 organization. And so we'd love to get your monthly support. That's really key, is those monthly donors. So I'm also thankful for the partnership of our sponsors, Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Evolution 2.0, and Traffic Buffet. Thank you to the tech team. Chris, we've been working on a few different things here, a new program for live streaming, so we're still figuring things out there. Thank you to our guests today, Jenna Ellis and Dr. Danny Caroll Rodas. And I want to thank you for your devotion to listening to this show, for dealing with these difficult issues, for thinking about how is it that we should think about an issue like immigration or atheism or whatever topic that we might be thinking about. So thank you for joining along with me as we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.